All right, shading practice. Now, there are lots of different ways to shade, but one that I want you to start practicing right now is what I call a solid fill. That is to say, this is not hatching or cross hatching where you see the lines, but is a solid fill of an area that ends up not having any variation or as little variation as you can in depth or darkness, and has little to no changes in as far as like lines or things like that you can see. I want you to set your paper up like this so that you have 3 boxes at the top in varying sizes, and these are just going to be practice boxes. Then a 1-inch grid with 3 boxes of 1-inch grids, and then a 1-inch grid with 5 boxes. So let's start with the practice ones. This is where I want you to really get a feel for this idea of filling something without ending up with kind of a lot of lines or overall looks. The other thing you want to kind of guard against is a lot of pressure, which leads to shine on your paper. Now, if you happen to have a set of artists' drawing pencils that have the letters on them, so the H's and the B's, this is a really good time to get those out and kind of make use of them. This is also a point at which you're going to want to be careful of your paper. Try to make sure that you've got, if you've got any of the paper that I sent home with you, this is a good time to use it. If you have any drawing paper available to you, you want to use it, because the better quality drawing paper is going to give you a better result than, say, just using copy paper or paper from the printer. Now, I want you to sort of think back to maybe 2nd or 3rd grade. I want you to sort of go back in time in your head, and I want you to think about how you felt about coloring, like coloring books at that point, where you were old enough to want to make something look good, and you could control the crayons to a point where you could stay within the lines, and you would try to get things just as smooth as you possibly could. You weren't hastily going through these things. You were young enough to enjoy the process, but old enough to be able to control your crayons and the pressure that you put on. And I want you to sort of channel that time period where you just could really give into the process of filling space in. And I want you to think about that as you're working. Because what you don't want to do is rush this and then end up with a lot of lines or a lot of just kind of messiness to this. So take your time with these practice boxes. I want you to do at minimum of 3. Feel free to do more if you're feeling like it's taking you a little bit more time. I want you to hold your pencil fairly loosely. The tighter you hold it, the more of a grip you have on it, and the harder you press, the less control you actually end up having. So it's kind of counterintuitive in that way. You think that you have more control if you hold it tighter or you have put a lot of pressure on it, but you actually end up having less control at that point. I want you to focus on making small movements with your pencil. This is not a time for like big lines like this. You want to keep it very steady, a steady mid pressure, actually a fairly light pressure, because you can always go back over and build things up. But if you put a lot of pressure in the beginning especially, you burn the paper. That's when it gets all shiny, and then you can't go back over it. Now I want you to notice something right here. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. I want to show you what's happening here, because this is something kind of important for later on. Do you notice how there is a line that's showing up here? Do you see that as it goes down? That is an incised line, which means it's actually pressed into the paper. What happened is I made a line originally here, and then I erased it, And then what was left over is this place where the pencil actually pressed into the paper, pushing down the fibers. And so when I go over it with the shading, when I go over it trying to make this smooth, it is absolutely impossible for me to smooth out that area. I can actually feel the abrasion under my pencil as I go over it. So this is important for a couple reasons. Number one, when you go about your guidelines that we've been talking about, when you create all of those guidelines, and even when you're creating your initial interior lines, you do not want to press into the paper at all. You want to hold your pencil lightly. You want to lay it down so that you can just see it. You do not want to, because if you press into the paper like I did with that, I made a firm line, I erase it, number one, I can still see it there. Do you see that? And number two, when I go back over it to fill in any form, that incision immediately comes up. Now this line, which I can see well enough, if I erase it, number one, it goes away almost completely. And then if I go back over it, that same spot, there's no incised line. So while you're making your initial lines, when you're making your contour shapes, when you're graphing out your shadow shapes, you do not want to press at all. So it's partly because you want to be able to erase and you don't want to be able to see it, but it's partly because of what happens here with that incision. So I want you to fill a few boxes. You're going to be making small motions with your pencil. You're going to be changing the directions of it. And again, I'm not pressing at all. I'm running the pencil across the paper, but I'm not applying any pressure. I'm holding, I'm going to pull this back a little bit. Let's see if you can see it. I hold the pencil back. I hold the pencil back towards the end of the pencil, rather than holding it up close, choking up on it like this, which would have me put more pressure on it. Instead, I hold it back towards the end, and that keeps me from applying really any pressure at all to it. So once you've filled a few boxes, 3 at least, more if you want to, once you get a good feel for just this overall process, then I want you to move on to the gradients. So the first one you're going to do is this 3-step gradient. So you're going to start with, this is going to be, you can go either direction, it really doesn't matter. You can go from dark to light or from light to dark, it doesn't matter. I'm going to go lightest, mid, so your middle one is always going to be middle, and then darkest. I want you to actually start with this middle box. Don't start with the lightest, don't start with the darkest, start with the middle, because then you can go darker from there and lighter from there, and it's a good way of holding on to it. Try to keep your pencil as sharp as you can. This is like a terribly dull pencil at this point. I don't have my X-Acto knife with me, so I'm just going to kind of cope for a while, but the sharper your pencil is, the easier this process will be. So for this mid-tone box, you're going to keep it, mid-tone. Don't apply any pressure. You're probably going to want to go over it maybe twice. So you go over it kind of in one direction, and then you're going over it, and you're continually turning your pencil so that it's building up the value, but it's not digging into the paper at all. What you'll see as you kind of go along is you'll see the variety in the paper texture itself. You'll see the paper texture, the roughness of it, and some of the irregularities in it. If you have a very smooth paper, There will be less of that if you have a rougher paper. There will be more. This process, it takes time. I expect that you will spend quite a bit of time on it, actually. It's not, if you get it done in 5-10 minutes, then you didn't do it correctly. But on the plus side, it's a good time for like an audiobook, listen to some music. It can be soothing. In fact, the more relaxed you are with it, then the better result you'll get. If you're rushed, if you're tense, it's not going to turn out very well. So for this exercise, really all I'm looking for you to do is to create these solid fills. We're going to work on edges, on transitions, on going from light to dark later on. But for the moment, since this does take some getting used to, I just want you to practice filling the spaces, filling them evenly as you can. And know that it is going to take some practice, and that if you don't get it right away, just do it again. Every time we do something, we get better at it. I think that there's this idea today that we should be able to do everything right away. That if we don't get it at first, then either it's not worth putting the time into, or somehow then we just don't have some magical gene for it. Like we're just not talented at it. And a lot of this isn't talent, it's just patience. It's just being willing to put in some time to train your hand to work at a certain pressure. Train your eye to be able to see differences in value and tone. All right, so that's about a decent mid-tone. This actually is, I'm kind of going a little fast. I would probably spend, another 5 or 10 minutes on it, maybe, just this one box. If I wanted to really perfect it, I'd go in with a kneaded eraser and pluck out all of the little dark spots. I'd go in with a 2H after it and kind of even out some of the uneven areas. So once you have a middle tone, then what you're going to do is go one step lighter on one side and one step darker. And they're both equally difficult. Light is difficult because you don't want to leave gaps in between, and especially if you are just using, like I am, just kind of your classic number 2 pencil, you're not switching to a lighter drawing pencil, it can be a little bit trickier. But what you do essentially is you just hold your pencil even lighter. I mean, actually mine is so loosely held that it's actually wobbling a little bit in my grip. I'm keeping it very, very light. I'm not putting any pressure down at all. I'm just skimming it along the surface of the paper, trying to channel like not even a skipping stone, like a water strider or some insect that just jumps along the edge of the water. So now these three are actually going to be pretty far apart, because then what we're going to do is we're going to add a step in between each one as we come down to the next one. Now darkest, Darkest is a little bit tricky. You have to apply a little bit more pressure, but at the same time, you do not want to press into the paper. Again, you do not want to press because it immediately will kind of take on this shine, which is the process of the paper actually kind of getting ruined. It burns the paper. So you want to work in layers. So if this one I did probably 3 layers, this was like 1, a little bit more than 1. You know, this one's going to be more like probably 5 or 6 layers. And again, it takes patience. It takes patience and a sharpened pencil and movement that is small and steady. It's not all over the place. But you'll notice my hand is, I guess you can't really see it. Let's see. My hand is a little bit more choked up on this one because I am applying more pressure. But I'm still trying to keep it loose. I don't want to apply a ton of pressure. Some is necessary because I'm going for a darker tone. If you are having trouble with pressure, like you are a person who writes heavily, who writes boldly, what can be useful is to do a sort of a practice round like I did up at the top. Where you practice making lines and erasing them, and then getting to a point where you can erase the lines and not have any sort of incision into the paper. Because it's one of those things that I can talk about it, but until you feel it, it's not going to make that big of a difference. So that took me about 15 minutes to do this section here. So I want you to plan on spending probably 10 minutes doing your practice boxes, including if you're having trouble with your pressure, doing some of the line exercises where you make lines, erase them, and then see if you're incising them until you get a feel for how loosely to be holding your pencil. For Friday, just focus on getting 3 practice boxes, any pressure incising things that you need to do, and the absolute best you can do with a 3-step scale. So starting with your mid-tone, doing your lightest, and your darkest. Then for Monday, what we're going to do is we're going to transfer the lightest to the first box, the mid-tone to the middle box, the darkest to the last box, and then you'll also be adding in a half step in between each. But that takes, in and of itself, that takes like 30 minutes. So we'll save that for Monday. All right. Oops, actually, let me show you there. There we go. I didn't realize I was out. So, still set up your paper with 3 practice boxes of varying sizes, 1-inch grid with 3 squares for what you're going to do today, and then go ahead and also set up your grids, your 5-inch grid, for Monday that you're going to go ahead and transfer to and start working on Monday. But for tomorrow, for Friday, plan on working on this for probably 20 minutes, and plan on working on the practice ones, for 10 or 15, depending on how long it takes you to sort of get the feel for it.